Today we are here in the Supreme Court's building in Carson City, Nevada, interviewing Susan Southwick, who served from 1983 until her retirement in January of 2003 as the law librarian of the Nevada Supreme Court Library. Prior to her appointment as the court's head librarian, Susan served the Supreme Court's library beginning in 1980 as one of only 2 professional librarians, and thus was the de facto assistant law librarian, though her formal role was that of chief cataloger, who also did reference. Prior to coming to the court, Susan served first as a catalog network library, interlibrary loan librarian, and then as a reference librarian at the Nevada State Library, after beginning her career as director of the Dixon, California Public Library. Susan, let's begin with a little of your personal history. Could you tell us a little bit about your life when you were young and today?
Well, I grew up in the Sierra Nevada, sort of west of Reno, which is a mountainous area, obviously. We did a lot of camping and traveling around the country, seeing national parks, and so I've always liked the outdoors. That's been a big part of my life. After we moved to Nevada in 1972, we got into horses quite a bit, and we went in. My husband and I began to do horse packing in the Sierra Nevada, and we did that into the 90s till our horses got kind of old and we got kind of old, so we basically shifted down from that. We still have a couple of equines, but we don't pack or ride anymore. Mm-hmm. Right now we have a ranch out in central Nevada that it's mostly just a place to go have fun. Mm-hmm. And so we spend time out there roughing it, and when we're not doing that, we're mowing the lawn at home or something. It's a pretty quiet life these days.
Well, actually, doesn't sound like a bad existence, one way or
Suits
the
me.
other. Yeah. Having come through the mountains on the way here to Carson City yesterday, I saw some very gorgeous scenery, and it must have been very pleasant the many times you and your husband were up there. We're riding around or hiking around or looking around,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, it's very picturesque. Could you tell us a little bit about your education and professional training? What degrees do you hold, for example, and where did you go to college and then to library school?
I went to the University of California at Davis for my undergraduate degree. I got a BA in history in 1968. In 1969, my husband went to Vietnam, and I went to Berkeley to their School of Information Science, as it was called then. I think it was Library and Information Science, and I got my master's there at the end of 1969. And then I just went into being a public librarian first, and then the state library, and my job at the court, I sort of self-taught myself law librarianship. Mortimer Schwartz was teaching a course when I was in library school, but I didn't fit it into my schedule. I never conceived that I would actually go to work for a court. I figured I'd always be a small-town public librarian, which I only was for 2 years, and the rest of the time has been at a higher level.
That sort of leads me to ask how it was that you happened to be attracted to law librarianship. As you say, you started in the regular kind of library, as some of us still say, and then you moved to our niche in law librarianship. Could you tell us if somebody perhaps played a role in that, or how you came about?
Yes, somebody did. One of my former colleagues at the state library and a reference librarian moved to the court a few years before I did, and when the law librarian at that time left, she became the law librarian, and she asked me if I would like to come and catalog the library, because it was sort of a very arcane system, basically done alphabetically by author, and she thought it could be upgraded considerably. So I converted it all to LC. The KF classification had just come out then, so my cataloging background was very helpful. And I was doing the cataloging, and since there were really only 2 trained librarians on the staff, I did other things, as you mentioned before, as sort of a jack of all trades.
That probably made the job all the more interesting, though. It's interesting in looking at the history of law librarians, law librarianship, until relatively recent times, certainly the 1950s perhaps, it was sort of assumed that law libraries were self-arranging, self-cataloging, because you had the statutes and the court reports, and those were usually arranged by state in alphabetical order with the Fed system first. And then for those few other sorts of things, again, an alphabetical order by author was common. In fact, Fred Hicks, who had been the librarian at Yale for many years, had developed a system that was actually still used in that library until relatively recently, where if it was a treatise of some sort, it was under T on the shelf for treatise, and then a very long cutter number to keep it in alphabetical order by author's name, pretty much. It worked for a while, but unfortunately, as libraries got more diverse and larger, the kind of organization you brought to the table was really in order.
Well, that's true, especially as legal literature expanded. You didn't just have a few basic treatises so you knew Story, or you knew Collier, or you knew somebody's name, and you could just go to that area. I think it became imperative, and at least by the 80s, you had to have better organization.
Yeah. One of the questions I often ask, and I think you've already responded somewhat to it, is could you talk about some of the specific positions you've held and some of the things you've accomplished in them? I think you've talked about what you did as a cataloger and doer of anything else that needed to be done, but you eventually became director here at the Courts Library. You want to talk a little bit about that era? You have a building in your background, the one we're sitting in, for example?
Well, when I started at this library, it was in the sub-basement of what's called the Heroes Memorial Building. Or well, actually, it isn't called that, but it's next door to the Heroes Memorial Building. It was called the Supreme Court and Law Library, or Library Building. And the state library was in it when I started to work for the state library, and they closed that building, that portion of it, immediately after that, and they moved to another structure. But the court wanted the law library to stay there, so it stayed. And it moved from the third floor down into the sub-basement, which is where I knew it. It was a very terrible accommodations. It had old crummy shelving, which was kind of earthquake scary. The furniture that's outside here, the big old tables, those were all in there from the original, one of the original state library iterations. Was all done in the 30s, and so I kept that for atmosphere in this building somewhat. But in 1975, I believe it was, the court decided it wanted to take the library away from the state library, which suited them because this library ate up many of their resources, as law libraries tend to do. So we separated, and the quarters were getting, when I started there in 1980, it was pretty full, and it was pretty tacky, so we painted and we got some new shelving, but just couldn't really make it a nice place. Mm-hmm. And then the court ran out of room because they expanded from 5 to 7, and they needed more space to expand with their law. They increased their law clerks from 1 to 2, and their administrative office was getting larger, so they started lobbying for a building. And I got to plan the library space, I think I started planning it in 1989, and with a lot of input from my staff and how knowing how things worked, and we really wanted to make it a user-friendly library. At that time, we weren't so afraid of our users that we had to bolt everything down and hide behind screens and things, but we tried to make it a very open space, and we moved in here in 1992, so it's just been a little over 20 years, and I see that it looks like it's getting filled up now. The court has eyed the space here to expand down into it themselves, or some of their offices have, but so far the librarian has managed to fend them off, so it remains a library in its entirety. And it was a really great experience. We had fun working with the architects. I went to an AALL seminar in, I think it was Tempe, and it was in Arizona anyway, and it was on building a law library, and that was invaluable to give me the information that I needed to get started, and the considerations I needed to bring forward to the architects, because they didn't always think about book loads and things like that. And since that was crucial to the planning of the building, That was a very useful conference.
Well, I noticed in looking around this morning that you have a lot of compact shelving, and that, of course, has even more strict weight limit control necessary than regular shelving.
Yes, it
And
does.
yet I noticed that none of them are sagging, so you must have had them build it correctly.
Yes, well, we really we did a very extensive bid process for those shelves, and we did, I can't remember who we picked now, it was down between two of them, but so far they've held up very well. In fact, all the shelving is done really well.
Mhm. It's a very tastefully appointed library. I, sort of saying this a little out of school, but just walking around this morning, it's very accommodating to users, I think. And I was struck with the fact that as you walk into the building, you basically come right into the library. So the library, in a sense, is the welcoming center for the entire court, I guess. In fact, they may not see it that way, but it must be, people must come in and then they go from here to wherever they need to do other things, if there are other things they need to do.
That's true. By and large, the library, it is a public space in Nevada. It's considered a public library, and the state statutes require it be open at regular state hours. We were open at night with a key access, which was probably easier to do in the old building than in this one. We issued electronic key cards here, but we had a federal lawsuit by some pro-pers that were tax protesters, and they won it. And so they had equal access to attorneys, and that was a big pain because we had some very strange people who wanted to come in here, and they would actually spend the night, and the security would leave at midnight or something, and attorneys had always spent all-nighters in here trying to catch up, but I had to deal with the stresses of these unknowns that were in here.
So it was either nobody or everybody.
Right.
Was their approach.
Well, it turned out to be 8 to 5. Well, I guess everybody can stay until security leaves. I'm not sure what the current rules are, but that's about where I left it. I did take the keys away from everybody for weekend access, and after security left the building access, and that made me unpopular. But I knew I was leaving, and so the attorneys could be angry if they wanted to. I really felt that we had to do that. And I left in 2003. That was after, of course, 9/11, and so we were a little bit more aware of what could happen with a wide open building like this with people in it.
Yeah, I suppose even though Carson City seems to be sort of away from the beaten track, there still will be, I'm sure, people that come here that some of whom are up to no good, as they used to say.
Well, I mean, I think any community has people that are troublemakers that just get some sort of a thrill out of being a pest or obnoxious or something. And I think all libraries that are open to the public have to deal with those. We probably had to deal with them less than, say, the regular public library. We were fortunate in that for many, many years. We didn't have any problems. And we never had any really bad problems during my tenure either, so I can't complain in hindsight.
Well, I also hope you got along well with your former neighbors in that dungeon-type environment that you started out in, the state library, because I noticed in driving around that they're up at the other end of the block.
Yes, we built the buildings at the same time, and actually the court may not really want to hear this, but the state librarian was very, very politically astute and did a lot of maneuvering to get her library built. She built a big coalition of quite influential legislators at the time, and I sort of tagged on her coattails, and I don't think that this building was approved because of the library, but I think because of the association of two libraries, one of them that had a lot of support. This one sort of coattailed its way in, and
well, you obviously did something right, because it's a marvelous facility for a casual look that I had this morning. It really is very, very nice. And the whole campus is interesting. Here we are in the middle of the city, and the Capitol is on the other side of literally in the same block. I guess the state government is pretty much all right here. I saw one building, I think it was the Secretary of State, across one of the streets, but it's close, and it's sort of a nice little community of state people that you must have here.
Well, Nevada has always such been a small state that the government actually was all concentrated in this plaza here for years and years. This site had an old government building on it that was built in 1953, which they tore down to put this building here. The Supreme Court was in a building that was built for it in 1937. Before that, it was in the Capitol building, and the Capitol had everybody, the governor, the Supreme Court, the legislature in there, the treasurer, Secretary of State. The Secretary of State moved to the building they're in now. Is a really historic building, but when I first moved here, it was a hardware store, the best hardware store you could ever go to. And so they adapted that to their purposes, but the government has expanded considerably, and now they're quite large office buildings all around, and they still rent space, I believe, in some other places.
I live in the state capital of my state, Olympia, Washington, and we see state agencies scattered all over town, and actually even some of them in adjacent towns. My son works for one of the agencies, and his office and his group are in a town called Lacey, which is actually right adjacent to Olympia. But there was a movement for a while to force all the state government offices back into the capital city, but apparently it was not totally successful because
Price tags get in the way sometimes.
they do, although they also have a few offices up in Seattle, and price tags go the other direction when you get up there.
We have the same issue with Las Vegas because obviously that's the population center, way bottom heavy, I should say, because of its geographic position. But since a lot of the justices are from there, they've expanded their courthouse to accommodate the judges' offices. And they have hearings there now too.
Well, that's probably good for everybody, because the people who are, bringing cases before the court don't have to travel as far perhaps then if they're down there, and the justices are able to hear some of the stuff there. Probably works pretty well. Susan, you have been a member of AALL for many years, and among other things served as president of the Western Pacific chapter in the late 1980s, and you've been on various committees. You've also held memberships in the Nevada Library Association and the California Library Association, perhaps in other organizations as well. And I have learned through the background I did before we did this interview that you were a regular person at AALL's annual meetings over the years. Including the one that you were part of in local arrangements back in 1989, which was held up here in Reno at an interesting hotel. It was the only one, instead of a normal lobby, you'd walk through the casino to go to any place, but it was a lot of fun. So you were part of the local arrangements committee for that, and those were in the days when the local people did an awful lot more of the work than they do today, with headquarters staff coming in and assisting more than they once were able to do. I wonder if you have any special memories of any of these activities or some of the meetings that you attended that you'd like to share this morning.
Well, I think I went to all of those meetings. I always budgeted for them, although I did pay a lot of it on my own money because I wanted to have my own room for one reason. But I got to see a lot of places of the country that I hadn't seen, many cities. I'm not much of a city person, and I didn't go for that reason. I went for the educational opportunities, and I was pretty good about hitting all of the meetings I planned to hit. There's not a lot of opportunity to get a continuing education in law librarianship, especially in this state. We didn't have the law school. It just opened when I just after or just before I left, so there were just probably maybe 7 law librarians in the state. We all sort of taught ourselves, and we worked close together, so there wasn't really even a lot of ability to have a lot of camaraderie, like lunch all the time or something. So this was a great place to build professional contacts, learn new things, keep up with the field, meet a lot of the vendors. It was just some of the special seminars that I went to, and I can't always remember exactly when or where. Time passes so fast. Those were invaluable, like the building one especially, that stands out. But I
Mhm.
think there were some other ones that I went to that helped me with a particular problem that I had. So the people that I met, many of them from the West, that was a wonderful expansion of my professional contacts. And I enjoyed knowing them for many years. We'd see each other every year, and sometimes we'd even get together outside of the meetings. So it had a lot of benefits to me.
Mhm. Those of us who worked in a little more compact environment, I worked for 30 years in Washington, D.C., and we could get together for lunch quite readily, and meetings were, we had about 5 a year where the entire group got together. So it's a little different challenge out here in the West. Things are not exactly, should we say, right down the street.
No.
Or by subway, even if they're across town.
It's true. Sandra Mars in Washoe County was the closest person,
Mhm.
and there really weren't many county law librarians. There was one in Clark County, and there was one law firm that had a quite large collection that had a librarian for a while. But there were and there was one at the Judicial College, and until the law school, there were only just that few of us.
It's interesting, you talk about the law school, and it's here now in the state, but this was the only state, I believe, that did not have a law school for a while. Now, some people might say, well, that's a good idea, but it really was different in that sense. And for a while, there was I don't know if he was a senator or representative, I think it was a senator in Washington, D.C., who would find promising young people, mostly young guys in those days, out here who he thought should go to law school, and he would send them back or have them come back to D.C., and many of them went to the law school at which I was on the faculty, American University. This was actually more prior to my time, but we talked about this. And when we set up an alum office, basically to begin fundraising and that sort of thing, we found that the American University had a lot of alums concentrated in this state. So our development people would come out here and pay visits from time to time and reconnect with them. But apparently it was this senator who was the catalyst by which they came east to go to law school, and then selected our law school as the one to which they in which they do their studies. It's an interesting story. But as you say, you now have a law school in the States, so maybe they don't all have to go back there or wherever. During your career, Susan, you actually wrote a number of items. I noticed specifically one of your publications was called Organizing the State Agency Collection. You wrote that back in about 1975. Another one was Researching Legislative History in Nevada, which is in the Nevada Legal Research Guide published by Hine, who's doing these oral histories back about in 2012. And you have an update of the court system information in the 1996 edition of Political History of Nevada, which was published by your own Secretary of State's office. In addition to these publications, you've served the broader legal profession as a project director for the National Historic Records Preservation Administration grant to develop Supreme Court rules for the preservation of court records for the various lower courts here in the state of Nevada. And you were recruited by Supreme Court Justice Cliff Young in 1988 to serve as secretary for his then new nonprofit, the Nevada Judicial Historical Society. I understand that this last undertaking, though it was sort of seen as a volunteer, kind of one of those things you do for a while, has become more part of your life, and you're still involved in it. Could you talk a little bit about perhaps some of these activities and why you thought that they were important for you as the state Supreme Court librarian?
Well, as far as the publications go, the cataloging, the state agency collection I did that in self-defense because many agencies collected all sorts of stuff that their people would get at conferences and wanted to organize, but they didn't know how to do it. So they would, because I was the principal cataloger for the State Library's cataloging center, they would approach me and ask, so I just wrote it up. It's pretty small time. In fact, I had forgotten all about it until you mentioned it. But I cataloged it, so it's out there.
You'd be surprised what one can turn up with Google and a few other similar sources that are out there.
The one on the court, developing the court rules, that kind of came about because, again, people were always trying to find out what they should keep in their local district courts and justices' courts. It was a huge problem in Las Vegas because they generate so much paper. And so I don't remember who sponsored this one, but there was a conference in Sacramento, and it might have been a court-sponsored seminar, but it basically instructed, it was about maintaining court records and what you should keep and how you should keep them and things like that. So I went to that. It was in San Francisco. I, again, met a bunch of new people that were useful to know. Came back and I wrote a grant with the help of some people at the State Library and Archives to the Records Retention I can never remember the NHPRC, National Historic Preservation of Records Administration. I can't remember the sum, but it was to hire an archivist who would actually do the legwork and go around and interview the courts and find out what they were doing, because nobody really had an overview of that at this court. The archives, meanwhile, had actually surveyed the Supreme Court's own records, and they had come up with their own idea of what they were going to keep and how they were going to keep them. But I hired somebody that was just out of school. He was trained, and he went all over the state, many, many miles on his automobile, and interviewed all of these court clerks at all levels of court. The court system's not very complex in Nevada, but he did visit all of them, and he was amazed at how nobody ever threw anything away. They might put it in a pile of pigeon poop in an attic, but it was there somewhere and it was retrievable. So he came back, and I was a pretty nasty editor. He kept writing his thing, and I kept editing it, and finally we agreed upon the text, and it went out, and then we did seminars together around the state to teach to go over the details of what we had discovered with the clerks. And then we started working up some draft rules, and eventually he went on he was here when we actually got the rules adopted by the court, and that was interesting to me because I had never actually had to ask the court to do something before for me. It was always sometimes hard to get their attention, but we did get them drafted, and they adopted them, and they're still there. They're published in the Nevada Revised Statutes. And so everybody has some guidelines to go by now.
It's probably very helpful. Speaking of things, in a sense, maybe this is a little unfair, you and I have both been retired about a decade, and there's been an awful lot of change in our field in just those last few years while we were retired. But given what you saw when you were still active and probably have seen since, do you have any thoughts about where the library services to courts especially may be headed in the next few years, or what changes might be coming? Do you have any thoughts on that you'd like to share?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on it. I don't know if I have enough time to express them, but I was obviously active when Westlaw and LexisNexis started up. Mm-hmm. And we had an old clunky computer, but we got it fairly soon and we had just one, but we got trained on it, and then we started setting up seminars for the West and the LexisNexis people to train the local lawyers and the court staff. And that went on for quite a while. We were arranged with the bar to get them CLE units for their training, so that was, we got them introduced into it pretty well. And for most of the time that I was here in the 80s and 90s, into the thousands, we were the only place that had Westlaw. finally, after we moved into this building, the Attorney General decided they wanted to get LexisNexis, so they went off on their own. So we lost a big number of our users that way. But we were still in charge of all the training and the access point to online legal research. Then about the time I left, the West expanded its services to the court and the clerks, and then they stopped using the library. They were using their own things more and more. And in a way, we sort of marginalized ourselves out because people thought they could do it all on their own, and they do it on their own. But my concern is that library's strengths, I think, are bringing together not only just the raw legal materials, but the treatise materials, which have had experts write them from a perspective that puts things into legal perspective. So when you're just searching in a giant database using algorithms, no matter how good you are, you lose that context, especially when you're a law clerk, because you don't have the experience to recognize that maybe there's a drift in the common law that you're not taking, that because you found some cases that seem to fit your little point and you go with them. And I know that law schools, at least some people that I know that are going to law school, they're teaching more and more just from online research and less from the books. And I think that's going to water down the law in a way. It's sort of disturbing. I'm not an attorney myself, but I certainly knew how to use the treatises, and I could never even really convince the law clerks that just looking in the index and getting some concept of what the structure of that particular area of law was a better place to start than just jumping onto an online database and pumping in some searches, coming up with 1,200 answers and then getting mad because they wouldn't print it off for you. That happened more than once.
It's interesting, and from the law school perspective, one of our biggest problems over the years was having the books and having enough of them in copies so that our several hundred first-year law students or whatever group was trying to access them could all get access. And when the computers came in, Westlaw and Lexis databases, suddenly it solved that problem, and also the one of the book never being on the shelf when somebody was looking for it, because if you could figure out how to call it up, it was always there. But as you say, Susan, there's a downside to some of that. I mean, we have such a huge amount of information available today that I think you're right. The librarians will continue to play perhaps an ever increasing role in sort of taming this huge array of information and helping people develop search techniques and so on that can more effectively access it in all the right senses. It's an interesting experience. So I gather you do not think that court libraries are basically a thing of the past.
I think they're going to be more marginalized because they're so incredibly expensive. And when the legislature, for example, who's funding this can say, well, you can just get it on Westlaw, we're paying all this money for you to have Westlaw or LexisNexis, whatever the choice might be. Why do you need all those huge treatises? And it's going to be hard to defend. I often told the vendors that they were overpricing themselves so much that the market was not going to bear it after a while. And I'm really glad that I wasn't working here during this economic crash, because I know they had to cut many of the services that we had for years. This is an excellent library for the size of the state, and I know that somebody from New York was very impressed by it, in fact, and so I've been proud of it, and it would just break my heart to have to gut it, but I think economically that's going to become more and more of the way things go. And then, as I say, there was competition. There's even competition now for the space. And so unless you're very light on your feet and keep your finger to the pulse of the court, you might find yourself packing them up. And
well, I think you have that. You share that in common with all types of libraries, not just law libraries.
Yes.
I mean, we see it in academic places. The program keeps expanding, and whereas the lesser used real estate in the eyes of some of the faculty and dean, it's the library, because They don't go in there. They basically have the stuff brought to them, or they call it up on computers. So it's always an ever a non-ending kind of struggle to hold on to the resources that you really need to have available for those who come in to use the library.
That's true.
And, you know, again, the books take up space, and that is very expensive. I know early on some of our colleagues in some of the major metropolitan areas like New York City and places like that had to take that into consideration early on because of the huge cost of renting space to house whatever they were housing, including book collections. So there were stories out of New York even 20 and 30 years ago about downsizing collections due to that factor, especially in the private law libraries, the firms. It's interesting, your various perspectives, and I agree with what you say, that there is a need for us. The trouble is, we may have some challenges in how we meet that need
Yeah.
because of other realities and trade-offs that will have to be made. I want to thank you, Susan Southwick, for allowing us to visit with you today and for taking a few minutes to talk about yourself, the libraries, and whatever in general that we've been talking about quite a bit. Before closing, however, it's customary to give the person being interviewed an opportunity to sort of have the last word, and if there's anything that we have not talked about that you would like to mention, please feel free to do so now.
Well, I think we've covered all the highlights. It's sort of, you either do a little bit or you get into too much detail, so I'm perfectly happy with our discussion, and it's been my pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you, Susan. When we were planning to do these oral histories, Dick Spinelli and I were in communication, and you know, Dick from the company, and I naively said, well, if we let them go over 10 minutes, they'll be too long. Boy, was I wrong. They generally do last a bit longer than that. But I think it means that they're better interviews, and I do appreciate all you've shared this morning with us. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.